I'm Rachel Clemens. Today's webinar is on how to create effective audience surveys, because basically if you don't survey your audiences, it's really hard to know what they're looking for and what they want from you. And so we're going to talk today about how we can learn more about our supporters in order to better engage them and serve them. And we'll talk about strategies to get the answers you're looking for, tactics you can use to build well-crafted surveys, and we'll highlight considerations for analysis. Now, I want to say right up front that this is not a session for the data nerds. If you're a data nerd, you're going to know all this already. If you went to school for research, you're going to know this already. If you're like most of us communicators or fundraisers or membership people, we didn't necessarily get this in school, so we're going to go over today how to do audience surveys effectively, the basics, but also a little bit beyond the basics as well. And then just keep in mind that everything here applies to most surveys. So if you are at a nonprofit and you're thinking about a donor survey, these principles are going to apply. If you're at an association and you're thinking about a membership survey, or a university and you're thinking about alumni or student surveys, these will all apply. Everything I'm going to talk about here applies to all different types of surveys, so don't worry about that. Okay, I'm Rachel Clemens. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Mighty Citizen. Believe it or not, despite our beginning here, I am good with technology and with communications, and I've been doing this for about 20 years. And here at Mighty Citizen, we do branding, marketing, and digital experiences for all mission-driven organizations. So across the board, from nonprofits to associations, government, and universities. And we're based in Austin, Texas, where it is a beautiful day today, and I hope it's beautiful where you are too. Okay, what surveys can tell us? They can tell us what motivates our supporters. So why are our supporters our supporters? Why did they engage with us in the first place? Why did they continue to engage with us? Gives us lots of information about that. How can we better engage with our audiences? So what do they want from us? What are we doing well? What are we not doing so well? Who our supporters are, so what are their demographics? What motivates them? What keeps them bound together? What are some persona information we might be able to pull from our supporters in order to better communicate with them? Why aren't, insert your audience here, engaging more? Why aren't young audiences engaging more? Why aren't we reaching a certain demographic? You can get more information about certain audiences by surveying them. And how good is our stewardship? How well are we stewarding our donors, our members, our alumni, our students? How well are we continuing to cultivate relationships with them? Because in the end, research kills opinions. And what do I mean by this? When I go into an organization, I'm talking to them about creating a survey. What often happens is I'll ask a question and they'll answer that question. So if I say, for example, what motivates your donors to give to you? I'll get answers back from them, and I might get lots of answers. And in fact, there may not really be good consensus in the room about why their donors give. So they're giving me their opinions. They're giving me information that is based in some form of likely anecdotal information. So, well, so-and-so told me they give because of this, and I think that that's true. What research does is it really kills those opinions. It gives you actual data to say this is why our donors give to us. And if you don't have consensus within your organization, it also allows you to point to something that can drive consensus. So if your executive director, for example, is wanting to do something that just will not work with your audiences, we want to give you the research and the data to back up and tell them why that won't work. So by the end of the session today, you'll be able to describe the shortcomings and the benefits of surveys. We're going to start there. We're going to list the 6 principles of an effective survey. We'll write good survey questions. It's really important that your survey questions are written in an unbiased fashion, which is incredibly easy to be biased, and so we'll talk about how to remove that. We'll talk about analyzing and interpreting our survey results as well. Right. So what are the shortcomings and benefits of donor surveys? First of all, let's argue the point and make the case against surveys. Generally, people tend to estimate. And by that I mean they do a lot of, that sounds about right. And that's okay in general because, that's human tendency. That's not a surprise. But at the same time, it's just not 100% accurate if they are estimating, right? So if you've got a scale of 1 to 10, they kind of go, 7. And sometimes they'll give you inaccurate answers as well. So they might give you answers that they think you want to hear. You might sometimes be swayed by bad questions. Your recipients don't understand that you've written a bad question. You don't understand you have written a bad question. And so they'll answer that question thinking it is unbiased, and it's actually biased. And so they don't know the difference. And sometimes you don't either. It's hard to predict the future. We are not born with crystal balls. We so wish we were. But the fact is, if you're going to ask someone, hey, if we offered a chat bot on our website, would you use it? Well, that's really hard for them to answer. They want to say yes. They see themselves as their best selves in the future. I'll give you an example. When Netflix first came out, a decade or so ago, they used to ask people, what do you want to watch this weekend? And that would get you to add something to your queue. And so people were adding all these documentaries, all these things that would make them, be better people. And what they found is by the time the weekend rolled around, nobody wanted to see the documentaries. They wanted to watch Sharknado or some terrible comedy just to kind of break them out of their everyday lives. So while we have the best intentions for the future, they're not reliable. Bad questions look like good questions. This kind of goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. If you write a bad question, and by that I mean a biased question, your recipient is likely to answer that question, not realizing that it is biased. And it's hard to reach statistical significance. So statistical significance is basically truth. So it's the combination of asking enough people and getting a high enough response rate that you can hold that survey data up as truth. For most of our clients and the organizations we work with, they do not have the time or the resources to reach statistical significance. And therefore, you've got to look at your surveys as more indicators of truth, or kind of, it's not 100% accurate. You have to know that, but it's better than not having any information or having solely anecdotal information. Keep in mind that your surveys are wide but shallow, meaning you can survey a lot of people at one time, but you can't go really deep on a survey. And we'll talk about why that is, but you really can reach a lot of people, but you can't get a lot of information out of them. And so a lot of times you want to marry up surveys with other forms of research, like informational interviews, where you can get more qualitative information and go much deeper with a smaller amount of people. But there are lots of benefits to surveys, and the first is that it's flexible. They can be conducted in lots of ways. So they can be conducted on your website, via email, by social media with polling, or by phone. They can also be conducted in person. Sometimes many of us have hard to reach audiences, and we've got to go out in person and do these surveys. They can be anonymous, and the more, if your survey is anonymous, the more likely it is to be unbiased. And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that. They are cost effective. Quite honestly, to run survey data or surveys on platforms, online platforms, is fairly cheap, and they can quickly be put together. In fact, software like SurveyMonkey will offer up questions that are written by professionals that you can pull that might be appropriate for your survey. And then lastly, they're extensive. No other method provides such a large number of responses, so keep that in mind as well. So, should your organization conduct a survey? I'm going to tell you about this thing we talk about called the goodwill jar. And imagine that you're sitting across the table from a donor or a member or an alumni or a student or whoever your audience is that you want to survey. You're sitting across the table from them and you ask them to be a member or to donate money to you, and therefore they are putting money in the goodwill jar that is between you on that table. So sitting between you is this piggy bank, and they're putting a deposit in there. When you ask them to conduct or to fill out a survey for you, they're making another deposit into that piggy bank jar, and they're just putting in. So what you have to do is find ways to put a deposit back into the jar on your side. And one way to do that is to conduct a survey, and to make sure that when you conduct that survey, you take the information you get from it and you help serve them better with it. There's no point in doing a survey if you're not going to do anything with the information. You cannot conduct a survey solely because you're curious. That's not a good enough reason. We'll talk about purpose and goals behind surveys, but you really have got to have the intention to take action on that survey and put deposits back into that goodwill jar. So let's start with the 6 principles of effective survey design. So you've decided to conduct a survey, and here's where you're going to start. Before you write any questions, you're actually going to start with the purpose of the survey. So what is your goal? Now, you can have, a lot of times when you sit down and create this, survey strategy with people on your team, there's a lot of goals that come out of it. You want to make sure that you have one primary goal. It's absolutely okay to have multiple goals, but make sure that there's one that is driving your strategy. So that's your primary goal. Then ask yourself, what will we do with the information when we get it? So usually in our survey strategies, when we ask a question, the next line under that question, it will say what we're going to do with this information. So every time someone drafts a question, they're forced to answer what they're going to do with that. So what are you going to do with the information you get, and how will it be implemented? You want to make sure you understand upfront who within your organization needs to have buy-in. If you are asking questions of an audience about your programs, for example, you have got to have the program staff weighing in on that survey and making sure that they are comfortable with the questions that you're answering and that they understand why you're asking them and what those look like. What you don't want to have happen is that you're doing this in a silo, and then halfway through the survey or right before you launch the survey, your executive director, your teammate pops up and says, hey, I'd like to add 5 questions to that survey, and you've worked so hard to get it finalized. So make sure you ask yourself early, who needs to have buy-in on this, and who do I need to make sure is included? And keep in mind that different surveys might have different goals, and therefore you might have different surveys for each of those goals. So you could have a survey that's solely to learn about an audience. Maybe you want to find out more about them or their demographics. You can also have a survey that compares audiences. And so we'll take a look at this in a minute. Here's an example from University of Central Florida for their alumni survey. And this, when they wrote out their goals, these were their goals. Number 1, they wanted to understand alumni satisfaction with the Alumni Association. So how well did they understand and appreciate their benefits and activities? Secondary goals, they wanted to find out why alumni do or do not join the association and understand the interest of alumni in making contributions. So they're already alumni, they're members. What's their interest level in donating as well? So just an idea of how your goals could look. You want to make sure that your survey is targeted. A lot of times people will ask, how many people should I survey? And the truth to that is that, it depends on the audience that you're surveying. You can slice and dice your audience many different ways. So, maybe you want to look at them by age or their donation amount or how often they interact with your organization, how often, how long they've been a member. There's lots of different ways to slice and dice, and your data will tell you, how many you have in that audience. Now, you do want to make sure that you've got enough people to run a survey. So most surveys have about a 5 to 10% response rate. I actually think the technical answer to that is like 2 or 3%, but we typically see about 5 or 10% response rate. And so, if you have 200 people in that audience, you're looking at 10 to 20 people that you would be basing facts on, and that's really not enough to say, okay, that's worth running this survey. You do want to make sure you're looking at your data and your numbers to make sure you have a big enough audience. Having said that, remember that typically small and representative is going to be good for very specific surveys. So if you're trying to understand a program better, you want to engage people that interact with that program and maybe not your entire database. On the other hand, if you're thinking about going through a rebrand and you want to get a sense of your brand perception, you might want to send that survey to everybody in your database. So that might be bigger and broader, and that might be okay. So think about which audiences you're going to target. As I mentioned, you can slice and dice them lots of different ways. So one option is to slice them by age. So perhaps you have younger members or younger donors that you want to talk to versus older donors, how they interact with the org. We know that younger audiences want different things from us, and so you can run a survey solely based on age. You can also base it on lapsed versus engaged audiences. So for example, if you're an association, you could survey lapsed members versus engaged members and see the difference there, or donors or alumni members. Can also look at it by sex. It'd be kind of interesting to see, you know, what how women feel about certain programs or certain initiatives versus men. And then just because I'm in Texas, I got to get a dig in here and do a little bragging. You could also do it by greatness, the Texans versus everyone else. Remember though, no matter how you slice your data, to target an audience, you must have good data in your database. And not only that, but you must feel confident in the data that you have. Because what you don't want to do is send someone a survey about a particular program and they have no idea what you're talking about. They've never interacted with that program. Okay, number 3 in terms of how to make a survey effective is to keep it short. That's Napoleon, by the way. That's my Napoleon joke. So short surveys produce higher response rates. The shorter it is, the less people have to do, the faster they get through that survey, and the more likely they are to fill it out. Ideally, your survey takes fewer than 5 minutes to complete. So keep in mind, you want to keep it nice and short. And again, that's how you're going to get more people to fill it out. Ideally, it would also have fewer than 10 questions. So again, if you're trying to do under 5 minutes, you can't ask a whole lot of questions. So just make sure you're trying to keep it under 10. And you want to have fewer than 10 if you include a lot of open-ended questions. We're going to talk more about what this looks like, but basically open-ended questions are those where you ask people to fill in text in a text box. So if you're asking them to do a lot of that, then you want to have even fewer, you know, a max of maybe 3 of those. Your survey needs to be delivered well. It has to be intuitive and work on multiple browsers. So you really want to test your survey, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But it absolutely has to be mobile friendly. Many of our audiences are engaging with our social media or email via phone, and that number is just increasing. And so they're going from their phones to your survey, and therefore your survey has to work really well on a mobile device and be super easy to fill out there. That's another argument for it being short, right? People are not going to scroll a whole lot on a phone. You want to make sure when you send out your survey reminders, so you're going to send out a survey, you're going to email everybody and let them know the survey went out. And then you're going to send a follow-up reminder, you know, maybe a week later. When you send that follow-up reminder, go ahead and remove anyone from your list who's already answered that survey. Because if they've already answered the survey and then they also get a reminder, they feel doubtful. They're kind of like, well, did I fill it out? They might try to fill it out again. They might wonder if their responses went through. You don't want to create doubt. Doubt is bad for your brand. So make sure you're removing anyone from those survey reminder emails. I mentioned testing. It's really important that you test your email, your survey. You only get one shot for people to fill this thing out. You can't really make edits to your survey after it started running, because then you will have messed up data. You'll have some people that filled it out pre-fix and some people that filled it out post-fix, and it's really hard to compare anything or gather anything in that fashion. So make sure you have tested every possible scenario when you run your survey. I recommend reading the questions out loud. You're more likely to catch your grammar mistakes or spelling mistakes when you read out loud. It just forces you kind of to slow down. So do that. Test it over and over again. Test it on lots of devices, test it on different browsers. I always recommend testing it with a neighbor. So you want to test it with people who haven't seen it. You've been living and breathing this survey. You may have used jargon that is particular to your organization. And so if you share it with people within your organization, which is good practice, just know that they may also understand that jargon, and they're not likely to flag it and say, oh, this is jargon, people won't understand that. So I always recommend a neighbor, because they're friendly enough. If you're friendly with your neighbors, they can take a quick survey for you, but they don't know the ins and outs of the work that you do. And so if they kind of turn to you and ask you a question, that's an indication you need to work on wherever they got stuck. And then effective surveys are incentivized, and I put an asterisk here because there's kind of implications for this. So incentives are great because they can increase your response rate by 5 to 20%. And here's what I mean by an incentive. A lot of times you'll see a survey where if you take it, you're in the drawing to win a gift card. That's one example of an incentive. And another example, we had a client, this was public radio, and I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but they had a whole bunch of CDs in their warehouse, and they wanted to get rid of the CDs. They've been piling up, And so they decided they were going to give a CD away to everyone that filled out the survey. And so you want to make sure that, that was great for them. They had a lot of response for that. And they had to also ship out all of those CDs. So that's a consideration as well. But don't let your incentive be too big. For example, you would not want to give away like a $500 gift card. That's just too large, and you're going to have people filling out the survey solely as a chance to win. You want it to be big enough to be a carrot, but not so big that like everybody sends it to all their family members too, right? So think, we usually do about $100 gift card. If the survey is going out to a large number of people, tens of thousands, we might do several gift cards. And have people kind of, fill out the survey and then do a drawing at the end. So again, make sure that incentives are easy to allocate. Those CDs that went out, they had to ship them out to everyone. That cost postage. They were willing to do that. We talked about that beforehand. Another org I've heard of, A&M did, Texas A&M gave away maroon bluebonnets. Didn't mean to dig at A&M there, being here in Austin, but they gave away maroon bluebonnets, which their audience loved. They did this for their alumni when they sent out a survey, and those were really light and easy to ship. So just consider, how you're going to allocate and ship those incentives. Keep in mind though, with incentives, that if a user doesn't share their contact information, they can't get the incentive. So if you want an anonymous survey, you cannot also have an incentive, because you have to know who filled out the survey in order to get them an incentive. One way we kind of get around this is leaving the option open for people to either be anonymous or to leave their contact information. So, the last line in our survey will say something like, you can choose to remain anonymous if you'd like to be considered for our survey, for our incentive, please fill in your contact information. So that's one way to kind of get around it a little bit. All right, so we've now got our survey strategy in place. Notice we have not written any questions yet. You do not jump right into writing questions. You're just working on kind of the strategy up front. And then as you start to craft your questions, we want to make sure that we're crafting good survey questions. So there's two types of survey questions. One is closed questions, and they are measurable, and the other are open questions, and they are more revealing. So let's dive into each one of these. Closed questions are those questions where I ask you a question and then I give you a list of options to answer that question. So here's an example from UT Austin. Have you already included UT Austin in your estate plans? And their options are yes, no, I plan to, or I'm undecided at this time. Notice those are nice big buttons. They work great on mobile. So the UX, the user experience of the survey is really nice. And there's 4 options there. Closed questions provide a list of acceptable responses. They are typically multiple choice. They can be yes, no, they can be checklist, they can be scales, scale of 1 to 10, those sort of things. They're easier and less time consuming on both ends of the survey. So they're much faster and easier for your audience to answer, meaning, they don't take a whole lot of forethought in order to do that. And then they are also easier for you to analyze as well. So keep that in mind. Excuse me. Just be careful not to bias them. Because you are answering these questions, it can be easy to, make sure you're providing the answers. So if you don't look at all the possible answers, you may not get, the truth that you're seeking. Here's an example of a survey. It's actually a podcast survey, and so it had 8 pages. This survey was 8 pages long, far too long, but it was mostly full of closed questions. And this is an example of some of those. So what's your age, what's your gender, highest level of education? One thing I want to point out for you when you think about closed questions is you've got to make sure that you are highlighting all possible answers. Make sure you've covered your bases. So in this example here, what is your gender? I'm highlighting the other box. So their options are male, female, prefer not to say, and other. For some organizations, you will not be able to do this. So for whatever reason, just politically, religiously, it is not going to make sense for you to offer something other than male, female. However, for most of us, we've got to offer other options at this point. So just make sure you're covering your bases. Here's some examples of open questions. Now, open questions are more revealing. This means they're the text box where you ask the question, you ask them to answer with their own words. So they're writing in an answer inside a text box. Some examples might be, why did you choose to become a donor? What's the one way we could best show our appreciation for you? What one word would you use to describe our scholarship program? Why did you choose to become a member? So there's all kinds of ways that you can tweak it that's appropriate to the audience. So again, open questions allow respondents to answer in their own words, and they provide unanticipated insights. When people use their own words, you find out all kinds of things you never would have known. Usually when we go into a survey, we have a working knowledge of the audience, and a lot of times surveys just, they confirm what we thought we knew. With actual data. And so that happens a lot, but I have never done a survey with a client or on our own where we have not found something unexpected. And the unexpected insights come from typically these open questions when you allow people to type in their own responses. So that's the value of them. They're hugely valuable. They also tend to encourage more reflection because they're forced to kind of think in their own words and therefore more accuracy. So they do slow people down in filling out surveys. They take longer, but they also tend to be more accurate. And they require more human time to analyze. So just like they take more time for your user to fill out, they take more time for you to analyze. This is why in a typical survey, we'll recommend no more than 2 to 3 open questions. I'll give you an example. We did a survey with a performing arts center, and we sent it to 50,000. It was a brand survey. So it went to a large group, 50,000 people in their database. We got 2,500 responses right on the dot, around 5%. And we had 3 open questions in that survey. So then we had to dig through 7,500 individual open question responses. So it adds up quickly. Just be real cognizant of that. So in that podcast survey I mentioned, again, there were 8 pages. However, only 2 of their questions were open questions. What do you like most about this podcast, and what do you like least? Okay, so again, just really you want to be slim with these open questions. So in your particular survey, should you ask closed questions, open questions, or both? Chances are you likely want to do both. Again, it goes back to the purpose of your survey. Can you do your full survey in closed questions? Sure, you probably can. And make sure with closed questions that you have an other box too. It kind of covers you for people to write in open answers if they want to. But typically, again, the unexpected insights do come from the open questions. So I will typically recommend both. And again, I don't recommend doing more than about 3 open-ended questions. If you find you need more than 3, you're probably going to want to adopt a different research method. So again, you might want to move to informational interviews or something like that. In general, we try to marry our surveys with our informational interviews to get a little deeper. One last thing, don't do this. This audience or this organization will remain nameless, but basically this is a big wall of scales, and a lot of organizations do this. You'll see this, they'll have like a 1 to 10 point scale, and then they'll ask you 10 different questions based on that scale, and it's taxing on the mind. So while these are closed questions and they should be really quick, the wall of scale is intimidating for your users. Also, don't do this. This was recent, so you'll notice that the recipient or the person sending the email is do not reply, and then the subject line is tell us what you think. This was someone requesting a survey response from me, and they had do not reply as their email name. So just keep this in mind, and this is why we test. Like, go ahead and test the email, send the email to yourself, things like that. Okay, so we are going to do a pop quiz, and I'm going to ask you guys to chat into your questions box for me, the answers to these questions. What's wrong with these questions? So what is the fallacy in these questions? Okay, question number 1. What is the most affordable and most fun summer camp? Go ahead and put that in your questions box for me. All right, so many of you are getting this. We're asking 2 questions here. So we're asking what's the most affordable summer camp and what's the most fun summer camp. And this is nearly impossible to answer because, you know, what's most affordable in your perception may not also be what is most fun. So again, we're asking 2 questions in one. And when I present this session, a lot of times people kind of raise their hand and say, you know, that is a really subjective question for a survey. I mean, you're asking people the most fun summer camp, and that's okay because sometimes your surveys are there just to get perception. The purpose of the survey is to understand brand perception, perhaps. And so, you know, asking a question like this that is gauging perception is absolutely fine. Oops, jumped ahead. No. Okay. Here's here's the way to fix it. What's the most affordable summer camp and what is the most fun summer camp? So again, you can split it into 2 different questions. And once you realize you're doing this, a lot of times people will end up making 1 question or 2 questions into one when they're trying to get their survey down under 10 questions. And so they think, oh, I'll just combine them. But again, cannot do that. Don't do that. Okay, question number 2. What is wrong with this one? How much do you enjoy our annual event? So go ahead and get your responses in. I'll look for that. Yes. By mere fact that we say enjoy, we have biased our question, right? So we're framing this as a positive. What if they didn't enjoy it? They're not going to want to tell you that now because you basically set them up to only enjoy it. So again, you want to change this to something like, what is your opinion of our annual event? So using unbiased words versus positive framing. Question number 2, or sorry, 3. What's wrong with this question? When were you born? Before 1950, 1950 to 1960, 1960 to 70, 70 to 80, or after 80? Now on surface, we've got all of our bases covered here. But right, okay, so we have, what if you were born in 1960? Do you choose B or do you choose C? These are not mutually exclusive options, and this is one thing to definitely look out for when you do your surveys. So again, you want to shift it, you know, 50 to 59, 60 to 69. Okay, last one. How often do you visit our website? So the options are never, sometimes, regularly, and often. What's wrong with this question? These answers are vague. So you might think you've covered your bases, but what's the difference between sometimes and regularly? How do I distinguish between B and C? So you want to switch it and say, which option best describes how often you visit our website? Never, a few times per year, once per month, once per week, or almost daily. These are concrete and specific. Most people can remember if they've done something within the last 7 days or roughly the last 30. Once you get into a few months, I might think it was 2 months ago and turns out it was 8 months ago. That happens to me all the time. So make sure that they're real concrete. The other thing is you always want to cover your bases with I never do that. People tend to forget that option, that I never do something. They just assume you do, or I always do something. So make sure you're including your extremes as well. Okay, 5 survey analysis techniques. Let's go into these as well and see how, once we get our information back, how we analyze it. Read all responses for patterns. So that's number 1. So when you get those open questions, make sure you go through and read all of those answers. I go through, so it's really easy when your survey is active to jump into your data, like if you're using SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or something like that. It's really easy to, in the middle of that survey, jump into your data and start looking at it. I geek out on that stuff. I find myself getting giddy about it. It's kind of ridiculous, but I want to jump in there and look at everything. But I have to really force myself not to do that. I will only look at survey data once it is all in. The only thing I will check in the process of doing a survey is how many responses I have. That's the only thing I'll allow myself to look at. That's usually right there on the dashboard, so it's easy to see without seeing anything else. And sometimes you want to know that, so you know if you need to push it a little bit more. But I really hold all of my viewing until the very end of the survey because I want to be unbiased when I go in to reading everything. Otherwise, you can start to kind of bias yourself just by seeing stuff early on. So once that survey data is in, I go through and read it multiple times. So each of those open questions, I read it after the first time. I kind of think like, okay, what do I remember? So if I read 100 different responses to the same question, I might make some notes about what stood out in my head about those responses, like what patterns emerged. And then I go back through them again and I begin to name them and group them as they relate to each other. So for example, I typically will use a tagging system and I'll say this response is an answer to a particular campaign. You know, if the question is why are you a member? Well, I was, you know, this campaign spoke to me, or my parents were lifelong members, and it's important to me to carry that on. So I'll start to see, I'll tag those things, you know, like lifelong members or campaign. I'll just start to pattern them together, and your software should allow you to do this pretty easily, and then sort them that way. So you can start to see, you know, which ones kind of rise up to the top and have more of the answers. And then you can also use a word cloud when it's appropriate. And this is what a word cloud looks like. It's a quick and easy way to kind of see visually the responses to a particular question. And so you'll notice when I was talking about the open-ended questions and I was giving you examples, I often said, like, what one word would you use to describe X? And so the reason I always like the one word answers is it's easy, even though it's open, it's easier for people to kind of come up with an adjective or a word. And then also it's easy for me to analyze because I can pop it into a Wordle or a word cloud. So this one, for example, is in response to the summer camp question. What one word would you use to describe summer camp? And so what's beautiful about this is I also can see what words our audiences use to describe our summer camp, and therefore I can use those same words. And they may not be the words we've been using. So if playing or play was not key to our summer camp language, it's going to be now. I'm definitely going to be using it now. In general, be careful with averages. You don't really, when you're using scales, you don't really want to use averages to report those numbers. So in this example, cats are better than dogs. On a 1.5 scale where 1 is disagree and 5 agree, you might get 5 responses, and they're 2, 3, 3, 4, and 5. So they're kind of across the board. If you were to average those responses, you're going to get 3.4 as your average. So kind of neutral to positive. You may also get, separate, running the same survey at a different time, you might get these responses, 2 1s and 3 5s. Well, those responses are really disparate. Like they are passionate one way or the other about whether cats are better than dogs, but your average is still 3.4. So it still looks neutral. It looks like you got neutral feedback, and it matches the number for the more mixed results. So instead of that, this is how you want to show your responses to a scale question. You want to show it by the number. So 40% somewhat agreed, 20% agreed, 40. So that'll show any discrepancies or disparate information much better than an average. Make sure you're focusing on the big picture. It's really easy to focus on specifics and on outliers. If someone is a good writer and they write a passionate, open question response, you're likely to give that response more weight than the person who's not a good writer. And that's just human nature. So be cognizant of that as you're moving through your surveys. Also, sometimes you'll get one particular piece of feedback that is either glowing or it stings, and the sting ones really hurt. Don't put, if it's one piece of feedback from one person and you didn't hear anything else like it anywhere else, maybe call that person if you can, get a little bit more information, but don't beat up the whole survey or your whole program or whatever because of that one piece of information. Instead, you really want to notice those big items. And if there are outliers or strange anomalies, like say you're seeing a piece of feedback coming up over and over again, again, you may want to marry that with some informational interviews. Like, oh, this is something I need to look into further. And the way to do that is to go and interview these people. I've gotten as much as I can probably get from the survey. I'm going to go test and get more information again. And then you generally want to be more skeptical of good news than bad news. People tend to believe bad news. Well, they tend to believe good news. And therefore, just be aware that like if everything's glowing, was there bias in your survey? So typically you will get some mixed feedback, and that's kind of what you're looking for. So just be skeptical if everything's rah. And remember too, depending on the audience, they're predisposed to like you. So if you're surveying donors, for example, well, hopefully your donors really like you, right? But just be aware there's probably more information lurking if you haven't asked the right questions. And then lastly, confirm the information that you're getting and then make change. So again, I cannot stress enough that there's no point in doing a survey unless you are going to enact change. So keep in mind too, surveys are just one of the research tools at your disposal. I have mentioned informational interviews. Sometimes we call them stakeholder interviews. And that is typically when we do work with our clients, it's paired with surveys so that we can go deeper with a few people. And then focus groups is another obvious option. So getting people in a room and discussing how they feel about something. You can also conduct a survey more than once. In fact, this is a really good way. So one of the challenges with brand is measuring it. Brand is notoriously difficult to measure. So if I were thinking about a brand effort or, maybe redesigning my brand or my logo or whatever, I would do a survey early on before I did anything to get perception noted and just make sure I understood where we stood with our audiences. And then I would undergo the brand change. And then maybe a year after the brand had been out, or maybe 6 months, depending on timing, I would come back and do that exact same survey again. So if you're going to run a survey, if you know already that you're going to run a survey more than once, you want to make sure the questions you're asking now will also serve you, 6 months from now, a year from now, whatever that looks like. Make sure you're making changes in your organization once a clear picture emerges. Again, this is that thing where, we asked in our strategy for this question, here's what I'm going to do with the information when I get it. And I'm going to act on that. And so if you are not going to act on the information that you're getting, don't ask it. Just that's a question you can take out and make that survey shorter. So if you don't have an action item for each of your questions, don't ask it. The survey is really in an effort to make change and to better your organization. Start small with the change to make sure you're headed in the right direction. So again, you can start with something a little bit like, say you're going to make a programmatic shift and you run a survey and you find out, you might find out people don't actually really understand the program. They don't understand the benefits of it. They don't know why it exists. And so you get that information, you make some small changes. You can go back and survey that audience again to see if that change has been realized, if they better understand it now, if they've even noticed you've made a change. So again, you can make change and then survey again to see if you're headed in the right direction. And then lastly, report back. A lot of times what happens most of the time, when you fill out a survey, you do not get the responses back. Like you don't have any idea of what everyone else said, how you stood in comparison to what everyone else said. And you don't understand what the organization is going to do about anything that they received. So look for ways to report back the information that you get from your survey and what your takeaways are from it. So this is an example from Barry University. They ran an alumni survey and they came back and said, this is how many alumni responded. Here's the breakdowns in terms of how they ranked certain things, where they live, and their reasons for giving back. This is all really powerful information, okay? So just keep that in mind. So a quick recap. Remember that surveys are an inexpensive way to gather lots of data. So again, they're wide but shallow, so you probably want to marry them with some other research effort. and they are indicators, not 100% truth. Unless you're reaching statistical significance, you cannot hold them up as 100% truth. Make sure you're starting your survey with a goal and a plan. That absolutely comes before writing questions. And a good survey design is purposeful. It's targeted to certain audiences. It is brief or short. It's delivered well. It's often incentivized, but it is definitely tested. And you want to make sure that you are writing clear questions and providing context at the same time. You also want to read the results, so read through them multiple times. You want to avoid your quick assumptions. Also, I would recommend avoiding reading survey responses as they are coming in. And don't let the numbers fool you. Don't just report on averages. Because remember, at the end of the day, the purpose of a survey at its core is to make sure that you have information that you can hold up and say, this is how our audiences feel about this. Research kills opinions. If you walk into a room and I ask a question after a survey, almost everybody has the same answer because they're all pointing to the same data. Okay, so it's a really good tool for getting everybody on board and getting consensus about the direction you need to move in because you've got data to back it up. So before we get to questions, I want to mention that you can get the slides at mightycitizen.com/surveys. That is up and live now if you want to go grab that. Also, we have some tools available on that landing page. I've got a donor survey guide. So if you are in nonprofits or advancement at universities or foundations for an association and you want to get some get started, it's kind of a get started guide at doing donor surveys. I've got a tool for that. And then if that does not apply to you, if your audience is going to be more, related around communications and how you can better communicate with people, I've also got a survey up on just communicating better with your audience as well. And so you can get both of those at mightycitizen.com/surveys. And then you can also get more tools and templates at mightycitizen.com/tools. So I want to head over here and look at my questions, if you'll bear with me for a minute. So Richard asked, what about negative feedback from a survey? Do you report that back? Oh, sorry, I cut out there. I think it depends on the kind of negative feedback you're getting back. If you're getting wholesale negative feedback, then yeah, you might want to share that with your audience. I mean, if it's something that is a wholesale problem, you probably want to go to your audience and say, hey, as part of our survey feedback, we heard this, and here's how we're going to improve it. If you got kind of one-off feedback here and there, you have the option potentially to go back to that person. So say, for example, that you've run a donor survey and you've got a donor who's extremely unhappy and they left you their contact information. I would definitely recommend, my development director would be on the phone with that donor. That's an important, relationship, and I'd be making sure that they felt heard. If they're the only person that kind of gave you that feedback, I would not report that out to everyone. But that, just keep in mind that it kind of depends on the feedback you're getting. But even if you're getting wholesale poor feedback, I would want to share that back with my audiences. And then someone asked too, can you speak a little bit about the number of people you need to feel like you've got a good survey set? I would generally say I probably want to base my survey on 100 plus people. So again, if you don't have, so 100 plus people at 5 to 10% response rate is what, oh God, I'm doing math real quick. So you're looking at 500 people for, oh no, y'all don't ask me to do math. But you want to do, I would say, make sure you have at least 100 people responding to your survey to be able to feel pretty confident in it. And that's, that's a 10% response rate on 1,000 people. There we go, there's the math. Or 5% response rate on 2,000 people. So you got to have enough people to initially survey. And again, an incentive is going to help you reach those numbers just a bit. And then if you find that you do not have those kind of numbers, if your database, you're just starting out or your database just isn't that big, start with those informational interviews, do a dozen of those and kind of see what kind of information you get from those, perhaps. And then you could try to back that up with some survey information. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. I so appreciate y'all's time. I'm going to share my contact information here as well. If you have any questions or I didn't get to your question, feel free to ping me. My email is rclemens@mightycitizen.com. And again, we will be following up with slides and with a recording either later today or early tomorrow. And this also wraps up our Mighty Big Month at Home, our last webinar of April. So appreciate you guys attending today, and I look forward to next time. Thank you.